There is a moment, always the same moment, just before everything changes. It doesn't announce itself. There is no alarm, no warning broadcasts across every screen. Streets outside look the same, the shops are open, the restaurants are full. People are arguing about sport and politics and the price of things that don't matter. Life, in every visible sense, is continuing. And then it isn't. In 1720, the most sophisticated financial minds in Europe watched the Mississippi Company, John Law's great experiment in paper wealth, evaporate. $6 billion in modern equivalent value inside of 8 months. France had believed it had solved the problem of money itself. It hadn't. It had only deferred the reckoning. And when that reckoning arrived, it arrived so fast, so completely, and with such devastating precision that France would not recover true financial stability for another 40 years. The pattern is never unique. It has never been unique. And that is the part that should unsettle you. Because right now, in 2026, the United States of America, the European Union, Japan, and the entire architecture of the post-war financial world are sitting inside the most dangerous convergence of debt. Currency, instability, geopolitical fracture, and institutional collapse that any economist, historian, or financial analyst has ever measured simultaneously. This is not a warning about a recession. This is not a warning about a market correction. This is a documentary about the end of a financial era, an era that began in 1944. It's quietly mortgaged away across 8 decades and is now approaching its final settlement date. The question is not whether you believe it. The question is, what did the people of 1720 wish they had done differently in the 12 months before it was too late? On a warm July evening in 1944, in the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire delegates from 44 nations sat down to redesign the financial architecture of the entire world. The war was not yet over. The beaches of Normandy had been stormed only 4 weeks earlier. But the Allied powers already knew they were going to win, and more importantly, they already knew what kind of world they wanted to build when it was done. The old world, the world of competing gold standards, beggarthiner, currency devaluations, of the monetary chaos that had deepened and extended the Great Depression. That world was finished. What replaced it would be something entirely new, something that had never been tried before in human history. Every currency on Earth would be pegged to the US dollar. The US dollar alone would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per troy ounce. America, emerging from the war as the world's only undamaged industrial superpower, holding approximately 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves, would serve as the anchor of the entire global financial system. It was, in the language of that moment, a triumph of civilization over chaos. What it actually was, though no one in that room could see it yet, was a slow-motion debt trap, one that would take exactly 80 years to fully spring. The promise and the problem. The Bretton Woods system worked brilliantly for a time. The post-war decades produced the greatest sustained economic expansion in human history. The United States, as the issuer of the world's reserve currency, enjoyed what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called an exorbitant privilege: the ability to run deficits, to consume beyond its means, to borrow in its own currency, knowing the world had no choice but to hold dollars. But that privilege came with a structural flaw that was visible almost from the beginning. As early as 1960, economist Robert Triffin identified what would later bear his name: the Triffin dilemma. For the world to have enough dollars to function, to trade, to settle debts, to hold as reserves, America had to run persistent trade deficits. But running persistent deficits would eventually undermine confidence in the dollar's gold backing. The system carried within it the seeds of its own contradiction. For 27 years, the world chose to ignore that contradiction. And then, in August 1971, it could no longer be ignored. The moment the fuse was lit on the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on American television and announced something that most viewers did not immediately understand, but that would reshape every financial transaction on the planet for the next 50 years and beyond. The United States, Nixon declared, was suspending the convertibility of the dollar to gold, immediately, unilaterally, without Consultation with the 44 nations that had built their entire monetary systems around that promise made in New Hampshire. 27 years earlier, the Bretton Woods Agreement was dead. The gold standard in any form was over. What replaced it was something economists call a fiat currency system. The dollar would no longer be backed by anything physical. Its value would rest entirely on trust, on the belief that the United States government would manage its finances responsibly, that the Federal Reserve would maintain purchasing power, that the world's confidence in America was well placed. Trust. That was the new foundation of the entire global financial system. Consider what that actually means. Every dollar in circulation, every bond, every mortgage, every pension fund, every savings account. Every trade settlement rests on nothing more substantial than a collective agreement to believe, not in gold, not in silver, not in any hard asset. And belief, as history has demonstrated with brutal consistency, is the most fragile foundation ever constructed. The debt trajectory, a line that only goes one direction. In 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, the United States federal debt stood at approximately $398 billion. Debt to GDP was around 35%. By the standards of any historical era, this was manageable. It was, in fact, the kind of fiscal position that most empires would have envied. What happened next was not an accident. It was a choice, made repeatedly, across 12 different presidential administrations, by both political parties across 5 decades. The choice, every single time, was to borrow rather than adjust. In 1981, federal debt crossed $1 trillion for the first time. Ronald Reagan declared it a national crisis. A decade later, it crossed $4 trillion. In 2000, it stood at $5.7 trillion. Then came the decisions that would permanently alter the trajectory. The post-9/11 wars, the Bush tax cuts, the 2008 financial crisis bailouts, the Obama stimulus, the Trump tax cuts, and then the event that broke every remaining fiscal constraint, the COVID-19 pandemic. Between March 2020 and December 2021, the United States added $5 trillion to its national debt. In 21 months, more debt than was accumulated in the first 200 years of the Republic's existence. By 2025, total federal debt had crossed $36 trillion. Debt to GDP exceeded 123%. And the trajectory, the mathematical, inescapable trajectory, pointed in only one direction. The pattern that repeats here is what makes this more than just a fiscal argument. Here is what transforms it from a policy debate into a historical pattern. Every single financial crisis since 1971 to 1987, 1994, 1998, 2000, 2008, 2020, was resolved in exactly the same way. Adding more debt, by cutting interest rates, by expanding the money supply, by doing in larger quantities the thing that caused the problem in the first place. In 1987, when the stock market fell 22% in a single day, the Federal Reserve flooded the system with liquidity. Crisis contained. In 1998, when long-term capital management, a hedge fund managed by 2 Nobel Prize-winning economists, collapsed with $1.25 trillion in assets at risk, the Fed orchestrated a bailout. Crisis contained. In 2008, when the entire global banking system came within 72 hours of total seizure, the U.S. government committed $700 billion in TARP funds, and the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from $900 billion to $2.3 trillion virtually overnight. Crisis contained. Each rescue required a larger dose than the last. Each rescue created the conditions for the next, larger crisis. The debt accumulated with each intervention was never paid down. It was simply carried forward, growing with compound interest, waiting. This is not analysis. This is arithmetic. Spain's warning across the centuries, the historical parallel that most precisely mirrors this trajectory comes. It's not from the 20th century, but from the 16th. The Spanish Empire, at its height between 1500 and 1600, was the most powerful economic and military force on Earth. It commanded the gold and silver of the New World. Its navy dominated the seas. Its currency, the Spanish real, was the world's reserve currency for over a century. Spain in 1500 was what America is today. And Spain defaulted on its sovereign debt, Not once. 6 times. In 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647, for bankruptcies in 40 years, 6 in 90. Each time the crisis was resolved. Each time creditors negotiated new terms. Each time Spain borrowed more to service the debt it couldn't repay. Each time the ministers and advisors of the Spanish crown declared that this restructuring would be the last, that fiscal discipline would now prevail, that the empire was too important and too powerful to be allowed to fail. And each time, the underlying structural reality, an empire spending more than it produced, sustained by incoming treasure it hadn't earned through genuine economic output, reasserted itself with complete indifference to political will. By 1648, Spain was no longer the center of the world. The Dutch Republic, disciplined, commercially innovative, fiscally responsible, had claimed that mantle. And Spain would spend the next 2 centuries in slow, irreversible decline. The architecture of Spain's ruin was not built in 1647. It was built in 1519. When Charles I first began financing his empire on borrowed future revenues, the collapse was simply the moment when the future ran out. In 2026, the question history forces us to ask is this: at what point exactly did the future run out for America? And the more unsettling question, the one we will explore throughout this documentary, is whether that point is already behind us. The debt is built, the trajectory is set. But debt alone, throughout history, has rarely been the singular cause of collapse. What transforms a structural problem into a systemic catastrophe is always the same thing: a cluster of simultaneous triggers arriving together, reinforcing each other, overwhelming every defense at once, which is exactly what is forming right now. And that is where we go next. On May 11, 1931, a bank in Vienna called the Kreditanstalt released its annual financial report. It was a Thursday. The report showed losses that had been hidden, obscured, and quietly reorganized for the better part of 2 years. The bank, Austria's largest, the institution that handled the finances of the Austro-Hungarian aristocracy, the commercial backbone of Central Europe, was, in plain language, insolvent. The news crossed telegraph wires across Europe within hours. Within days, depositors in Austria, Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia began withdrawing funds. Within 60 days, 11 European banking systems had been destabilized. Within 6 months, Britain had been forced off the gold standard. Within 18 months, the Great Depression, which economists had begun to believe was easing, had deepened into something historians would spend the next century studying with a mixture of fascination and horror. 1 bank, 1 Thursday. 11 dominoes. The Kreditanstalt collapse is the most important financial event almost no one outside academic circles has ever heard of, precisely because it illustrates the central mechanism of systemic crisis. It was not the largest bank in the world. It was not even in one of the world's largest economies. It was connected deeply, invisibly, fatally connected to everything else. And in a connected system, the failure of one node does not stay local. It never does. What is gathering in the years between 2025 and 2028 is not 1 Kreditanstalt. It is 5, arriving simultaneously. And unlike 1931, there is no unencumbered superpower standing outside the system, capable of absorbing the shock. This time, the potential superpower absorber is the epicenter. Trigger 1, the debt maturity wall. Every bond has a maturity date, a moment when the loan comes due, and the borrower must either repay the principal or refinance, borrow again, whatever the current interest rate happens to be. For the United States government, that moment is not approaching gradually. It is arriving as a wall. Between 2025 and 2027, approximately $9.2 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, bonds, and notes issued when interest rates were near zero will reach maturity. It must be rolled over, refinanced, reissued to a market that now demands interest rates of between 4% and 5.5%, rather than the 0.25% to 0.5% rates that existed when much of this debt was originally sold. To understand what this means in practical terms, the U.S. government will pay roughly $900 billion in interest on its debt in 2025 alone. By 2027, under current projections, That figure approaches $1.2 trillion annually. For context, the entire U.S. defense budget is approximately $886 billion. The United States will be spending more servicing its debt than defending itself. And that interest payment is not discretionary. It cannot be cut, cannot be negotiated. It arrives every single day, compounding, regardless of what Congress decides, regardless of what the Federal Reserve does, regardless of what the economy produces. This is not a projection by a fringe economist. These numbers come from the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan, official, fiscal scorekeeper of the United States government.
Ow.
The maturity wall is not a risk. It's a scheduled event. Trigger 2, the fiscal doom loop. The doom loop is a specific mechanism that economists use to describe a self-reinforcing cycle of deterioration. It works like this. High debt levels require high interest payments. High interest payments require more borrowing to cover the gap between revenue and expenditure. More borrowing increases debt levels further. Higher debt levels push up the interest rate the market demands because lenders rationally want higher compensation for lending to a borrower whose balance sheet is deteriorating. Higher interest rates increase interest payments, and the cycle tightens. Every sovereign default in modern history has passed through a doom loop before the final crisis. The Greek debt crisis of 2010 is the textbook modern example. But Greece's debt, at its peak, was 350 billion euros. The Greek doom loop nearly destroyed the European Union. The US doom loop, operating on debt 40 times that size, the world's reserve currency, with derivatives and pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, all indexed to US Treasury stability, would be of an entirely different magnitude. What makes 2026 the critical window is the intersection of the maturity wall with the doom loop. The wall forces refinancing at high rates. High rates accelerate the doom loop. Accelerating doom loop pushes rates higher still. The mathematical endpoint of this sequence is not ambiguous. Trigger 3, the dollar weaponization backlash. On February 26, 2022, 2 days after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States and its allies took a step that no one in the modern financial system had ever taken before. They froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, reserves that Russia had accumulated over decades, held in Western financial institutions as sovereign wealth. The action was legally unprecedented. Central bank reserves held abroad had always been considered inviolable, a foundational assumption of the entire international monetary system. Nations held dollars and dollar-denominated assets as reserves precisely because they believed those assets were safe, liquid, and beyond political interference. That assumption ended on February 26, 2022. Within months of the Russian asset freeze, the central banks of China, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, and dozens of smaller nations began, quietly, methodically, and with great urgency reducing their exposure to US dollar reserves, not as a political statement, as a risk management response to a demonstrated reality. Dollars held abroad could be confiscated. By 2024, global central bank dollar reserves had fallen from 73% of total reserves in 2001 to approximately 58%, a decline that in the slow-moving world of reserve currency shifts is seismic. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, expanded to include Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, representing 45% of the world's population and 35% of global GDP, were in active negotiations for alternative settlement mechanisms. This is the Ottoman Empire's moment of 1875, replayed in the 21st century, when the Ottoman government, after decades of borrowing from European creditors at punishing rates, finally defaulted on its debt. The response from those creditors was the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a foreign body that effectively controlled Ottoman fiscal policy. The Ottomans had weaponized access to their market. The Europeans had weaponized access to credit. Both sides discovered that financial weapons, once used, permanently alter the relationship between the parties. The dollar's weaponization has done something that decades of economic competition could not. It has given every non-Western nation a compelling, urgent, self-interested reason to build alternatives to the dollar system. The process once begun does not reverse. Trigger 4, the the derivatives overhang there exists, sitting above the global economy like a financial dark matter. A market that most people have never heard of and that almost no one fully understands, including the institutions that operate within it. The global derivatives market. Notional value, approximately $600 to $700 trillion. Roughly 7 times the GDP of the entire planet. To be precise about what notional value means, it is not the amount of money that changes hands daily. Most derivatives are hedging instruments, bets that offset other bets. Designed so that gains and losses cancel out across the system under normal conditions, the net exposure is vastly smaller than the notional figure. The word normal is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. The risk in the derivatives market is not the everyday risk of individual contracts. The risk is correlation. The risk is what happens when a shock large enough to move markets simultaneously across multiple asset classes causes what risk managers call correlated failure. A moment when the hedges don't offset. When the models that assumed normal distribution of outcomes suddenly encounter a distribution that is not normal at all. In 2008, the derivatives market in mortgage-backed securities, a fraction of the overall market, produced losses that required $700 billion in emergency government intervention and came within 48 hours of seizing the entire global credit system. The notional value of mortgage derivatives in 2008 was approximately $35 trillion. The notional value of today's total derivatives market is $650 trillion. A correlated shock affecting just 1% of notional exposure produces $6.5 trillion in losses, roughly equal to the combined annual GDP of Japan and Germany. No financial system in history has ever successfully contained a shock of that magnitude, including the one that exists today. Trigger 5. The demographic cliff. Between 2024 and 2034, approximately 30 million American baby boomers, the largest and wealthiest generation in U.S. history, will cross from tax-paying, saving, working adults into full retirement. They will transition simultaneously from contributors to claimants, from net depositors into Social Security and Medicare to net withdrawers. The Social Security Trust Fund, on its current trajectory, reaches insolvency between 2032 and 2035, at which point benefits would automatically be cut by approximately 23% unless Congress acts. Medicare faces a similar timeline. The combined unfunded liability of these two programs, the money promised to current and future retirees that has no corresponding revenue source, exceeds $100 trillion by some actuarial estimates. This is not a political argument. It is a demographic fact. The people who will retire are already born. The tax base that must fund their retirement is fixed by the same demographic reality. The mathematics do not respond to political will. The Japanese asset bubble collapse of 1989, the closest modern parallel to what demographic-driven stagnation looks like at scale, offers a partial preview. Japan's population began aging dramatically in the 1990s. The working-age population shrank. Domestic consumption fell. Growth stagnated. The Nikkei 225 index, which peaked at 38,915 in December 1989, would not return to that level for 35 years. An entire generation of Japanese investors watched their country, the world's second-largest economy, technologically advanced, culturally cohesive, produce essentially zero real wealth growth for 3 decades. America's demographic cliff is not identical to Japan's. It is, in some respects, worse, because it is arriving simultaneously with the 4 other triggers described above. Japan's demographic stagnation unfolded against a backdrop of global growth that partly compensated for domestic weakness. America's will unfold as the global system itself is under strain. The convergence, this is the point that separates 2026 to 2028 from every previous warning, every previous crisis, every previous moment when serious analysts looked at American fiscal trajectory and raised the alarm. It is not one trigger, it is 5. And they are not sequential. They are not politely waiting for the previous crisis to resolve before the next one arrives. They are simultaneous, interlocking, and mutually reinforcing. The debt maturity wall drives up interest costs. Higher interest costs accelerate the doom loop. The doom loop erodes dollar credibility, Eroding credibility accelerates de-dollarization. Dollarization reduces demand for U.S. treasuries. Reduced demand pushes yields higher. Higher yields increase the cost of rolling over the maturity wall. And somewhere inside that cycle, at a moment that cannot be precisely predicted but can be historically anticipated, the derivatives market begins to price the unthinkable. Every financial system that has ever collapsed has had a moment when everyone knew, simultaneously, that the logic holding it together no longer applied. We may be approaching that moment. And to understand exactly how these mechanisms translate into real-world collapse, we need a map, a pattern, framework that has appeared in one form or another across every major monetary failure in recorded history. It has 7 stages, and we are already inside it. In 1925, a Soviet economist named Nikolai Kondratiev submitted a research paper to the Moscow Institute of Economics that would change and ultimately end his life. The paper describes something he had observed across decades of economic data from Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. Long waves of economic expansion and contraction. Cycles lasting 50 to 60 years, moving through recognizable phases with the predictability of seasons. Boom, slowdown, recession, depression, over and over, across different nations, different political systems, different centuries. Kondratev's sin was not the research, his sin was the implication. If economies moved in long, predictable cycles, if capitalism contained within itself the mechanism for its own periodic renewal, then Marxist doctrine, which held that capitalism was heading toward a single, terminal, irreversible collapse, was wrong. Capitalism would not die, it would simply keep cycling. Stalin had Kondratev arrested in 1938. He was shot the same year. The waves he described, now called Kondratev waves, survived him. They are studied today by economists at the IMF, the World Bank, and inside the research departments of the largest investment banks on Earth. And what those waves reveal when mapped against the monetary history of the last 300 years is something that cuts far deeper than simple boom-bust cycles. They reveal a pattern, 7 stages, appearing in every major monetary system that has ever existed, and a sequence of collapse so consistent across time, geography, political system, that calling it coincidence requires more faith than calling it pattern. Here are the 7 stages. Here's where we are. Stage 1, sound money. Every monetary system in recorded history begins in the same place, a hard constraint. Something that limits the ability of governments to create money from nothing, gold, silver, a fixed exchange rate, constitutional debt ceiling with teeth, or some other anchor that ties currency to reality. The discipline of a hard constraint does something that fiat systems cannot replicate. It forces genuine economic productivity. If you cannot print money, you must earn it. Trade surpluses matter, savings accumulate. Capital is allocated to genuinely productive uses rather than financial engineering. The Bretton Woods era from 1944 to 1971 represented stage 1 for the modern global monetary system. The dollar was constrained by gold. Constraint was imperfect. America had been inflating its money supply beyond what its gold reserves strictly permitted since the mid-1960s, to finance both the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs. But the constraint existed. The gold window was still open, anchor, however strained, still held. Stage 1 always feels like prosperity earned. In most cases, it partly is. Stage 2, debt expansion. The transition from stage 1 to stage 2 is almost always invisible while it is happening. It feels not like deterioration, but like improvement. Credit begins to grow faster than underlying economic output. This feels like growth because in the short term, it produces growth. Businesses borrow to expand. Consumers borrow to buy. Governments borrow to invest. Asset prices rise. Employment rises. Tax revenues rise. Everything appears to be working better than before. The debt-to-GDP ratio climbs slowly at first, then faster. But because growth is also rising, the ratio seems manageable. Economists and central bankers reassure that the debt is sustainable. The growth will outpace accumulation. That this time the expansion of credit represents genuine prosperity rather than borrowed future consumption. It always represents borrowed future consumption. Every time, without exception, America entered stage 2, formally in 1971, and remained there with accelerating intensity for the next 4 decades. The debt-to-GDP ratio that stood at 35% in 1971 moved to 50% by 1990, to 57% by 2000, and then began climbing at a pace that left the comfortable zone entirely behind. Stage 3. Currency debasement. When debt accumulates beyond the capacity of genuine economic output to service it, governments face a choice between 3 options. They can raise taxes sufficiently to close the gap, politically painful, rarely sufficient. They can cut spending sufficiently to close the gap, also politically painful, almost never attempted at the necessary scale. Or they can expand the money supply, inflate away the real value of the debt, making it cheaper to repay in debased currency. Every government in history has chosen the third option. Every single one. The French assignats of the 1790s are among history's most instructive examples of Stage 3 in its purest form. The revolutionary French government, facing catastrophic debt inherited from the Ancien regime and the costs of the Revolutionary Wars, began issuing paper currency backed by confiscated church lands. Initially, the system worked. The currency held value because the land backing was real. But the temptation to issue more assignats than the land could support proved irresistible. By 1795, the French government had issued 45 billion livres in assignats. Inflation reached 3,500%. A pair of boots cost the equivalent of a year's wages. The assignat system collapsed completely in 1796, replaced by a new currency that itself lost 70% of its value within 2 years. The United States entered Stage 3 incrementally. Beginning with the monetary expansion of the 1970s and accelerating dramatically after 2008, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the closest modern proxy for money creation, expanded from $900 billion in 2008 to $4.5 trillion in 2015. Then to $8.9 trillion by 2022, the money supply, as measured by M2, grew from $7.5 trillion in 2008 to $21.7 trillion by the inflation that followed, the worst since the 1970s, was not a surprise to anyone who understood monetary history. It was the inevitable Stage 3 consequence of Stage 2 decisions made across 4 decades. Stage 4, financial engineering. Stage 4 is perhaps the most dangerous stage, not because of what it destroys, but because of what it conceals. As debt accumulates and currency debases, the financial system develops increasingly complex instruments designed to obscure risk, manufacture apparent yield, and maintain the illusion of solvency. Derivatives multiply. Leverage increases. Financial products are created that generate paper profits without underlying economic productivity. The system becomes, in the language of economist Hyman Minsky, increasingly Ponzi, dependent on the continuous inflow of new capital and new credit simply to service existing obligations. The Weimar Republic's Stage 4 is less well known than its eventual hyperinflation, but it is more instructive. Between 1919 and 1921, before the hyperinflationary collapse of 1923, German banks developed increasingly elaborate financial structures designed to recycle war reparation debt, generate apparent balance sheet stability, and maintain access to international credit markets. These structures did not solve the underlying problem. They amplified it, ensuring that when confidence finally broke in 1922, the collapse moved at a speed and with a completeness that left no recovery mechanism intact. The global financial system of 2020 to 2025 is operating in stage 4 with a sophistication that Weimar's bankers could not have imagined. The $650 trillion derivatives market is Stage 4's ultimate expression, a financial superstructure of such complexity that its own architects cannot model all its failure modes. When asked to stress test derivatives exposure in a scenario of simultaneous sovereign debt crisis and dollar confidence collapse, the honest answer from the world's most sophisticated risk managers is that the models simply do not work at that scale. They were never designed to. Stage 4 always ends the same way, not with a managed reduction in complexity. With a sudden, violent, uncontrolled simplification. Stage 5, loss of confidence. Stage 5 is the hinge. It is the stage where the invisible becomes visible, where the structural problems that have been accumulating across stages 2, 3, and 4 suddenly break the surface of public consciousness. The signal of Stage 5 is not a stock market decline. Stock markets can fall and recover within Stage 2 or Stage 3 without triggering Stage 5. The signal of Stage 5 is something more specific and more dangerous. Bond markets begin to move against the sovereign. When bond investors, the most conservative, most analytically sophisticated participants in any financial system, begin demanding higher yields to compensate for perceived risk in lending to a government, that is not a market fluctuation. It is a verdict. It is the collective judgment of the people who have spent their careers studying sovereign debt, who have access to every relevant data point, have lived through every previous crisis, delivering their assessment of where the trajectory leads. Britain's experience in 1931 captures Stage 5 with painful clarity. The British pound had been restored to the gold standard in 1925 at its pre-war parity, decision even its architect, Winston Churchill, later described as the greatest mistake of his career. By 1931, the combination of war debt, Depression-era deflation, and an overvalued currency had created a current account crisis. International investors began withdrawing gold from the Bank of England at a rate that the bank could not sustain. On September 21, 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard, the anchor that had defined British monetary identity for 2 centuries. The pound fell 25% within weeks. The psychological effect on British financial prestige was irreversible. The era of British financial supremacy, which had lasted from the Napoleonic Wars through to 1914, ended not in 1931, but in the preceding months, when bond markets quietly delivered their verdict, and the Bank of England quietly ran out of options. The Yugoslav dinar's collapse in 1993 and 1994 illustrates what Stage 5 looks like at its most accelerated. Yugoslavia, disintegrating under the weight of civil war and international sanctions, watched its bond market cease to exist entirely. No buyer would accept Yugoslav sovereign debt at any yield. Stage 5, in that case, lasted approximately 6 weeks before transitioning directly to Stage 6. For the United States, Stage 5 signals are present but not yet dominant. The 10-year Treasury yield, which serves as the global benchmark for sovereign borrowing costs, it's moved from 0.5% in 2022 over 5% in 2023, a tenfold increase in the cost of long-term borrowing in 3 years. Foreign central bank holdings of U.S. Treasuries have declined for 6 consecutive quarters. The bond market is not yet in revolt, but it is watching. And in Stage 5, watching can become moving with very little warning. Stage 6, Crisis Cascade Stage 6, is where history stops being abstract and becomes immediate. It begins with a single failure, one institution, one market, one sovereign that exposes the interconnections hidden beneath Stage 4's financial engineering. That single failure triggers margin calls, which trigger asset sales, which trigger further price declines, which trigger further margin calls. Credit markets freeze as counterparties stop trusting each other's balance sheets. Liquidity, the lifeblood of any financial system, evaporates. In Stage 6, the speed of events overwhelms the response capacity of institutions. Central banks cut rates, but rates are already cut. They expand their balance sheets, but their balance sheets are already expanded. They coordinate with other central banks, but those other central banks face the same constraints. The tools that ended every previous crisis have already been used. The ammunition is spent. Stage 6 has never lasted more than 18 months in recorded monetary history before resolving in one direction or the other into Stage 7. Stage 7, reset or collapse. The final stage is binary. Either the system finds a mechanism for genuine structural reform, a Bretton Woods, a debt restructuring, a monetary reset backed by sufficient political will and international cooperation, or it collapses into currency failure, sovereign default, or systemic breakdown. The historical record is not encouraging. Of the 17 major monetary systems that have entered Stage 6 in the last 200 years, 11 proceeded to some form of Stage 7 collapse. 6 achieved partial resets, though in each case, the reset required either a world war, a political revolution, or both, to generate the social cohesion necessary for the sacrifices involved. We are currently positioned between Stage 5 and Stage 6. The structural problems are visible. The bond market is watching. The triggers are assembled. What has not yet occurred is the cascade event, the 21st century credit inch. that transition's watching into moving. But here is what history teaches, with brutal consistency, by the time Stage 6 begins. The decisions that will determine whether you are among those who survive it have already been made or not made, by the people who understood where Stage 5 was heading. Understanding the stages is one thing. Understanding why this particular Stage 6 will dwarf 1929 and 2008 requires a direct comparison, and that comparison reveals something deeply disturbing about the scale of what is coming. In October of 2001, in the city of Buenos Aires, a woman named Elena Perez stood in line outside a branch of Banco Nation for 11 hours. She was not there to make a withdrawal. She was there because the Argentine government had, without warning, announced the Corralito, a complete freeze on all bank accounts in the country. Depositors could withdraw no more than $250 per week. Savings that had taken decades to accumulate were locked behind glass, visible but untouchable, while the peso, which had been pegged to the US dollar at parity for a decade, began its catastrophic unraveling. Within 2 weeks, Argentina had 5 different presidents. Within 30 days, the government had defaulted on $93 billion in sovereign debt. At that moment, it's the largest sovereign default in history. Within 6 months, the peso had lost 75% of its value. Within a year, 57% of Argentines were living below the poverty line. People who had been middle class in January were destitute by December, not because they had made bad decisions, not because they had been reckless with money, but because the system they had trusted, the system they had built their lives around, had failed at the structural level. Elena Perez's story is not unique to Argentina. It is, with different names and different currencies, the story of every Stage 6 crisis in history. And understanding why what is forming in 2026 will dwarf both 1929 and 2008 requires understanding what was different and what was critically the same about each preceding crisis. The 1929 comparison, why it is too small. The Great Depression of 1929 was by any measure the defining economic catastrophe of the 20th century. Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 89% from its September 1929 peak to its July 1932 trough, a decline that took 25 years to fully recover. Unemployment in the United States reached 25%. Industrial production fell by half. International trade collapsed by 65%. Approximately 9,000 American banks failed between 1930 and 1933, wiping out the savings of millions of ordinary depositors who had no deposit insurance and no recourse. By any historical standard, 1929 was catastrophic. And yet, measured against the structural conditions of 2026, 1929 looks almost contained. Consider the leverage. In 1929, the maximum margin rate for stock purchases was 10%, meaning investors could buy $10 of stock for every $1 of their own capital. This 10-to-1 leverage was considered dangerously excessive by the standards of the day. It was one of the primary mechanisms by which the crash of October 1929 became self-reinforcing. Falling prices triggered margin calls, which triggered forced selling, which drove prices lower, which triggered further margin calls. Today, major financial institutions operate at leverage ratios of 25-to-1 to 30-to-1 on their balance sheets. The derivatives positions of the largest banks add effective leverage that the published ratios do not capture. The total credit market debt in the United States in 1929, all government, corporate, and household debt combined, was approximately $160 billion, roughly equal to 160% of GDP. Today, total U.S. credit market debt exceeds $95 trillion, approximately 350% of GDP. The 1929 crisis occurred within a gold standard system, a framework that, while it amplified the Depression's severity by preventing monetary expansion, also provided a hard floor beneath which the currency itself could not be debased. The dollar of 1933, though painful in its purchasing power, was still ultimately anchored to something physical. There was a limit to how far the debasement could go. In 2026, there is no floor. The dollar is backed by nothing but confidence. When confidence breaks in a fiat system, there is no gold window to close because it is already closed. There is no anchor to return to because the anchor was cut 55 years ago. The 1929 comparison fails not because 1929 was not serious. It fails because 1929 was a crisis of leverage within a system that still had structural integrity. What is forming now is a crisis of the system itself. The 2008 comparison, why it is too narrow? The financial crisis of 2008 is the comparison most frequently invoked by analysts, attempting to calibrate what a serious modern crisis looks like. It is a reasonable reference point in many respects. It was recent, it was severe. It involves sophisticated financial instruments and global contagion. And it came closer to total systemic failure than almost anyone outside the rooms where the decisions were made has fully acknowledged. Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve in 2008, later testified that in the 2 weeks following Lehman Brothers' collapse on September 15, 2008, 12 of the 13 most important financial institutions in the United States were on the verge of failure. 12 of 13. The global credit system came within days. Some participants say within hours of a complete freeze that would have stopped the processing of payroll, the settlement of trade, the functioning of supply chains, and the basic mechanics of commerce. The crisis was contained at enormous cost. The Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from $900 billion to $2.3 trillion within months. The U.S. government committed $700 billion in TARP funds. The UK, Europe, and major Asian economies all deployed their own emergency measures. The global financial system was, in the language of the time, saved. But here's the critical distinction between 2008 and what is forming now. 2008 was a crisis within the dollar system. Dollar itself was never in question. When fear swept global markets in October 2008, investors did not flee from the dollar, they fled to it. Treasury yields fell as capital rushed into the perceived safety of U.S. government bonds. The Federal Reserve could expand its balance sheet dramatically because the world was still willing, eager even to hold the dollars that expansion created. The Icelandic banking collapse of 2008 illustrates the distinction perfectly. Iceland's three major banks, Kaupthing, Landsbanki, and Glitnir, collapsed within days of each other in October 2008. With combined assets 10 times Iceland's GDP, the Icelandic krona lost half its value almost overnight. Iceland was forced to seek an IMF bailout. It was for Iceland a total systemic collapse. GDP fell 10%, unemployment tripled, and the country effectively declared national insolvency. Iceland survived because it was a small, isolated system with a floating currency that could be devalued. And because the global dollar system remained intact to provide the IMF funding that stabilized the krona. Iceland could default on its debts and restructure because the rest of the world was not defaulting alongside it. Now remove that assumption. Now imagine a scenario in which the crisis is not Iceland, not a peripheral economy with $100 billion in troubled assets, but the United States itself. Now imagine a scenario in which the dollar is not the safe haven to which capital flees, but the asset from which capital is fleeing. Now imagine that the IMF, whose funding is denominated in US dollars, whose largest contributor is the United States, cannot function as the backstop because the backstop itself is the source of the instability. This is not an imagination exercise. This is a structural possibility that was not present in 2008, was not present in 1929, and has no modern precedent for scale. The Forgotten Warning, Kreditanstalt, American sequel. The historical event that most precisely maps to the mechanism of 2026 is not 1929 or 2008. It is 1931, specifically the 6 months following the Kreditanstalt collapse, when a crisis that began in a single Austrian bank cascaded through the connected European financial system with a completeness and a speed that no one had modeled, anticipated, or prepared for. The American equivalent of the Kreditanstalt scenario in 2026 already has a candidate sector, commercial real estate. Between 2020 and 2022, with interest rates at near zero, commercial real estate, office buildings, retail centers, apartment complexes, hotels, was financed with approximately $2.9 trillion in loans. These loans were issued at interest rates of 3% to 4%. They were structured with 5 to 7 year terms, meaning the bulk of them come due for refinancing between 2025 and 2027. The properties they finance have, in many cases, lost 30% to 50% of their value, office buildings gutted by remote work adoption, retail spaces emptied by e-commerce, hotels still recovering from pandemic era losses. The loans that must be refinanced are, in many cases, larger than the current value of the assets they were written against. Refinancing at current rates of 6% to 7% would, for many borrowers, produce debt service costs that exceed the income the properties generate. This is not a projection. This is the current balance sheet reality of thousands of commercial real estate loans sitting on the books of regional and community banks across the United States, the same regional and community banks that serve as the primary lenders to small businesses, the primary processors of local commerce, the financial backbone of the non-metropolitan American economy. The Hungarian peng collapse of 1946, the worst hyperinflation ever recorded, reaching a monthly rate of 41.9 quadrillion %, began not with currency printing, but with the destruction of the productive asset base that backed the currency. Hungary's factories, infrastructure, and agricultural land had been physically destroyed by the war. When the asset base disappeared, the currency that represented claims on that asset base disappeared with it. Commercial real estate is not Hungary's factories, but it is a $20 trillion asset class that underpins the balance sheets of thousands of financial institutions. When a significant portion of that asset class reprices to reality simultaneously, and the maturity wall ensures that it must, the balance sheet damage is not contained to real estate. It spreads to every institution that holds those loans, every institution that has exposure to those institutions, and every market that prices based on the assumption of their solvency. The scale problem, what ultimately separates the coming crisis from 1929 and 2008, is not any single mechanism. It is scale combined with the absence of a credible rescue mechanism. In 1929, the rescue came from government spending and monetary expansion. The tools worked because the system retained structural integrity. In 2008, the rescue came from government spending, monetary expansion, and international coordination. The tools worked because the dollar system retained credibility. In 2026, the tools have already been used. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, which was $900 billion before 2008, stands at $7.5 trillion. Interest rates, which were 5.25% before 2008 and could be cut to zero as emergency stimulus, are already elevated, limiting the downside room available. The national debt, which was $10 trillion in 2008, is $36 trillion today, constraining the fiscal space available for emergency spending. The rescue mechanisms that ended 1929 and 2008 are not available in their previous form. What replaces them, if anything, is the central question of the next decade. There is one more piece of this architecture that must be understood before the full picture becomes clear, and it is the piece that determines whether any rescue is even possible. It is the question of the dollar itself, of whether the currency that has underwritten every rescue, every bailout, every emergency intervention since 1944 can continue to play that role, of whether the instrument of salvation is itself the thing that is breaking. That is where we go next. On the afternoon of June 8, 1974, in an ornate reception room inside the Saudi royal palace in Jeddah, Treasury Secretary William Simon and his deputy, Gerald Parsky, concluded a negotiation that would quietly govern the global financial order for the next 50 years. The terms were simple, elegant even, in the way that arrangements built on mutual self-interest tend to be. Saudi Arabia, sitting atop the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, the swing producer whose output decisions could move the global price of energy, would price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. It would recycle the surplus dollars it earned back into U.S. Treasury securities, financing American government spending. In return, the United States would guarantee Saudi security, provide military equipment, and ensure the survival of the House of Saud against any external or internal threat. Oil for dollars, dollars for security, security for oil. Henry Kissinger, who had architected the broader strategic framework, understood exactly what had been created. A mechanism that made the entire world dependent on dollars simply to purchase the one commodity that every modern economy required to function. It was not a trade agreement. It was not a currency policy. It was the construction of a global dollar trap, and for 50 years, every nation on Earth, whether it wished to or not, walked directly into it. That trap is now being dismantled, piece by piece, country by country, transaction by transaction. And the implications of its dismantling are so profound, so structurally significant, that they dwarf every other element of the crisis forming in 2026, the architecture of dollar dominance. To understand what de-dollarization means and why it matters so far beyond its immediate financial effects, it is necessary to understand precisely how dollar dominance was constructed and maintained across 5 decades. The petrodollar system created a self-reinforcing cycle of demand for U.S. currency that operated independently of America's underlying economic performance. Every barrel of oil sold anywhere on Earth, in Tokyo, in Berlin, in Sao Paulo, in Mumbai, required dollars to purchase. This meant that every oil-importing nation maintained permanent dollar reserves simply to guarantee its energy supply. Those reserves were overwhelmingly held in U.S. Treasury securities, lending money to the American government at whatever rate the market determined. The demand this created for dollars and treasuries was vast, structural, and essentially Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and other Gulf producers had no alternative use for hundreds of billions of dollars in annual surplus revenue. They bought treasuries. This kept U.S. interest rates lower than they would otherwise have been, allowing the American government to borrow more cheaply, enabling the debt expansion of Stage 2 to proceed with less immediate pain than the underlying arithmetic should have permitted. The system also gave the United States something no previous empire had ever possessed: the ability to impose financial sanctions that were effectively global. Because international trade settled in dollars through American correspondent banks, subject to American jurisdiction, any nation that the United States chose to exclude from the dollar system faced not merely inconvenience but potential economic isolation. The dollar was not merely a currency, it was infrastructure. And America controlled the infrastructure. This was the exorbitant privilege in its most complete form. And like every privilege built on structural dependency rather than genuine value creation, it created the conditions for its own eventual rejection, the cracks that became fractures. The first serious fracture appeared not in 2022, as most analyses suggest, but in 2003, when Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, began accepting euros for oil under the United Nations Oil for Food program. The experiment was brief, ended by the U.S. invasion, and largely forgotten. But it established something important: the theoretical possibility that oil could be priced in something other than dollars. The intellectual barrier had been crossed. The financial crisis of 2008 deepened the fracture. For the first time in the post-Bretton Woods era, major creditor nations, particularly China, which held approximately $1.3 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, began openly questioning the wisdom of holding the vast majority of their reserves in the currency of a nation that had just demonstrated its financial system could implode catastrophically. Chinese Premier Wen Jiabo said publicly in 2009 that he was worried about the safety of China's U.S. assets. The polite, diplomatic language barely concealed the structural concern beneath it. Then came February 26, 2022. The freezing of Russian central bank reserves, $300 billion, accumulated over decades, held in Western institutions as legally protected sovereign assets, was the moment that transformed theoretical concern into urgent operational reality for every non-Western central bank on Earth. The message delivered that day was unambiguous. Dollar reserves held in Western institutions were not safe stores of sovereign wealth. They were hostages. Within weeks, the question being asked in finance ministries from Riyadh to Beijing to New Delhi to Brasilia was no longer should we reduce dollar exposure, it was how quickly can we do it without destabilizing our own economies in the process. The reserve currency graveyard history offers a precise and deeply uncomfortable context for what is unfolding. The Portuguese real was the world's dominant trading currency in the early 16th century, the currency of the spice routes, of the African coastal trade, of the early Atlantic economy. Portuguese naval power declined and Spanish silver flooded the global economy. The real faded, not dramatically, and not in a single crisis. Over decades of slow, grinding erosion of relevance, until one day it simply wasn't the currency of international settlement anymore. The Spanish real, backed by the silver of Potosi, the most productive mine in human history, replaced it. Spanish pieces of 8 circulated from Manila to Mexico City to Amsterdam as the universal medium of international commerce. Then Spain's serial defaults, its military overextension. Its failure to convert resource wealth into productive economic capacity eroded confidence. The Dutch guilder rose to fill the vacuum. The Dutch guilder gave way to the British pound sterling, which dominated international finance from the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 until the catastrophe of 1914. Britain's exit from the gold standard in 1931 was not the end of sterling's reserve role that took another 25 years. But 1931 was the moment when the trajectory became irreversible. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain launched a military intervention in Egypt and was forced to abandon it within days because the United States threatened to dump sterling reserves and collapse the pound, was the final public confirmation of what had been structurally true for a generation. Sterling did not fall in 1956. It had been falling since 1914. Suez simply made it impossible to pretend otherwise. The average lifespan of a reserve currency, measured from peak dominance to replacement, is approximately 80 to 110 years. The dollar assumed reserve currency status in 1944. In 2026, it is 82 years old. It is not that the dollar must fail because of a number. It is that the conditions which historically accompany the transition from reserve currency, dominance, rising debt, military overextension, loss of manufacturing competitiveness, emergence of rival powers, active search for alternatives by previously dependent nations are all present simultaneously, at a moment when the dollar's age places it precisely within the historical window of transition. The Saudi pivot and the petrodollar's twilight on March 15, 2023. Saudi Arabia announced that it was in active discussions with China to settle a portion of its oil sales in Chinese yuan. The announcement was made without fanfare, almost as a technical footnote to broader trade discussions. Its significance was anything but technical. The Kissinger Arrangement of 1974, the deal that had underwritten the entire petrodollar system for 50 years, was openly, publicly, formally being questioned by its most essential participant, not abandoned, not terminated, questioned. But in the language of reserve currency history, that distinction is less meaningful than it appears. The Portuguese real was not abandoned either. It was simply questioned, then hedged against, then gradually replaced, over a period of decades that felt slow from the inside but look instantaneous in retrospect. China has been methodically constructing the alternative architecture for years. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, is a dollar-independent international settlement mechanism. Now processing trillions of dollars in annual transactions, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has established bilateral currency swap agreements among its members that bypass dollar settlement entirely. The BRICS nations, now representing nearly half the world's population, have discussed a commodity-backed trading currency, an idea that, as recently as 2015, would have been dismissed as theoretical. It is now a formal agenda item at BRICS summits. None of this means the dollar collapses tomorrow. Reserve currency transitions are measured in decades, not quarters. But the critical insight, the insight that the British learned too late in 1950, that the Dutch learned too late in 1780, that the Spanish learned too late in 1640, is that by the time a reserve currency transition is visible to ordinary observers, the structural shift has already occurred. What ordinary observers see is not the beginning of the end. It is the end of the end. The feedback loop that changes everything here is the mechanism that transforms a gradual reserve currency transition into an acute crisis event in the 2026 to 2028 window. As foreign central banks reduce their holdings of U.S. Treasuries, as de-dollarization accelerates from a trickle to a structural trend, the demand for U.S. government debt falls. When demand for U.S. government debt falls, yields must rise to attract sufficient buyers. When yields rise, the cost of rolling over the $9.2 trillion maturity wall increases. When rollover costs increase, the fiscal doom loop tightens. When the doom loop tightens, the dollar's credibility is further questioned. When the dollar's credibility is further questioned, central banks accelerate their diversification away from Treasury holdings. This is not a hypothetical feedback loop. Every element of it is currently active. Every element of it is measurable. Every element of it feeds into every other element in a self-reinforcing cycle that has no natural stopping point. short of either a credible structural reform of the kind that has historically required a world War II force, or a crisis severe enough to compel the international cooperation that reform requires. The British pound did not collapse in 1956 because of Suez. Suez was the moment of visibility. The moment when the structural reality that had been building for 40 years became undeniable to the last people still denying it. What collapsed in 1956 was not sterling. What collapsed was the last remaining pretense that Britain still sat at the center of the world financial order. America may be approaching its Suez moment. The exact trigger, the event that performs for the dollar what Suez performed for sterling, cannot be predicted with precision. But the structural conditions that make such a moment not just possible but historically inevitable are assembled with a completeness that would have been recognizable to any British Treasury official sitting in Whitehall in 1950. Watching the empire strain under the weight of debts it could not service and commitments it could not fulfill. The dollar is not dead, but it is no longer unquestioned. And in the history of reserve currencies, the distance between no longer unquestioned and no longer dominant is shorter than anyone inside the system ever believes until the moment it closes. There is one dimension of this coming crisis that no purely financial analysis can capture. Because what happens when a financial system breaks is not just an economic event. It is a human event. It changes how people think, how they vote, who they trust, what they are willing to do. It changes the social fabric in ways that can outlast the financial crisis itself by generations. And in the 21st century, with the velocity of information that now exists, the political polarization that is already present, with the institutional distrust that is already at historic lows, that human dimension may be the most consequential of all. That is where we go next. On the morning of March 9th, 2023, a Thursday, Peter Thiel's founders fund sent a message to its portfolio companies recommending they withdraw funds from Silicon Valley Bank. By Friday afternoon, $42 billion had left the bank. Not in queues outside branches, not in armored trucks carrying cash. In digital transfers, executed in seconds, coordinated through group chats, Slack channels, and Twitter threads by thousands of founders, venture capitalists, and startup executives who had read the same posts, processed the same fear, and made the same decision within the same 24-hour window. Silicon Valley Bank, the 16th largest bank in the United States, with $209 billion in assets, collapsed in 48 hours. The fastest bank run in the history of American finance. Not because its underlying loan book was catastrophically worse than other regional banks. Not because a single dramatic fraud had been uncovered. But because social media had compressed the timeline of panic from weeks to hours, and because institutional trust had already eroded to the point where, the moment a credible voice raised an alarm, the rational response for every depositor was to move first and ask questions later. The SVB collapse was, in isolation, a manageable event. The FDIC stepped in over the weekend, depositors were made whole. The system absorbed the shock. But SVB was not important for what it destroyed. It was important for what it demonstrated. It demonstrated that in 2023, a bank run that would have taken 3 weeks in 1930 time, in which regulators could intervene, reassurances could be issued, panic could be contained, now takes 48 hours. It demonstrated that social media has fundamentally altered the velocity of financial panic. And velocity in a crisis is everything. In 2026, if a crisis of the scale described in the preceding sections begins to unfold, the velocity of social contagion will not be measured in days. It will be measured in hours, possibly minutes. The trust deficit that predates the crisis. Every major financial collapse in history has been preceded by a deterioration of institutional trust, a period during which the public's confidence in governments, central banks, financial institutions, and media gradually erodes, leaving the social fabric too thin to absorb the shock of a genuine crisis without tearing. That deterioration is not a consequence of the coming crisis. It is a precondition that is already fully developed. The Edelman Trust Barometer, the most comprehensive annual survey of institutional trust across 28 countries, recorded in its 2024 report that trust in governments, media, and financial institutions across the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany had fallen to levels not seen since the survey began in 2000 in the United States. Only 39% of respondents trusted the government to do what is right. In France, that figure was 22%. Trust in central banks, the institutions whose credibility is the single most important factor in preventing a monetary crisis from becoming a monetary collapse, had declined by double digits across G7 nations since 2019. This matters because the primary tool that governments and central banks use to manage financial crises is not money. It is communication. It is the ability to stand at a podium or appear on a screen and say, "The system is sound, your deposits are safe, we have this under control," and be believed. When that belief is present, panics can be interrupted. Bank runs can be slowed. The self-fulfilling prophecy of collapse can be broken before it completes. When that belief is absent, when the population has already decided, through years of accumulated experience, that the institutions managing the system are either incompetent or dishonest, the communication tool does not work. The reassurance accelerates the panic, because if they're telling you everything is fine, the reasoning goes, everything is definitely not fine. The Weimar lesson: what happens after the money fails. The financial history of Weimar Germany between 1919 and 1923 is almost always told as a story about hyperinflation, about wheelbarrows of banknotes, about prices doubling daily, about the middle class watching its savings evaporate, while speculators and those with hard assets or foreign currency connections prospered obscenely. All of that is true. But it misses the more important story, the political and social story that the economic collapse produced. And that outlasted the economic crisis by a decade. By 1921, 2 years before the hyperinflationary peak, German institutional trust had already collapsed. The Kaiser was gone, the Republic was new, untested, and associated in the public mind with the humiliation of Versailles. The central bank, the Reichsbank, was widely understood to be monetizing government debt with complete disregard for the consequences. The judiciary, the police, and the civil service were staffed by men trained under an imperial system that had no loyalty to the new democratic order. When the hyperinflation of 1922 and 1923 arrived, it did not arrive into a society with functioning institutions capable of managing the crisis. It arrived into a society where those institutions had already lost legitimacy, where large portions of the population were actively looking for an alternative to the existing political order, and where the economic catastrophe provided the emotional and material conditions for radical political movements to fill the vacuum. The Nazi Party received 2.6% of the vote in the 1928 German federal election, 5 years after the hyperinflation, in a period of relative economic stability. By July 1932, with the Great Depression having delivered a second economic blow to a population still psychologically damaged from the first, they received 37.4%. The journey from 2.6% to 37.4% in 4 years is not primarily a story about economics. It is a story about what happens to a population that has lost faith in the existing order and been given a second reason to abandon it. No responsible analysis of 2026 draws a direct equivalence between Weimar Germany and the contemporary United States. The institutional differences are vast, the constitutional traditions are different, and the historical contexts are not identical. But the mechanism economic collapse acting not as the primary cause of political radicalization, but as the accelerant applied to a society already dry with distrust, is not historically unique to Germany. It is the standard pattern. And the distrust that existed in Germany in 1920 is measurably less severe than the distrust that exists in the United States, the United Kingdom, and France in 2025. The velocity problem, 2026, is not 1929. In September 1929, the process by which the stock market crash transmitted itself into the broader economy took months. Banks failed gradually over a period of years. The unemployment rate, which ultimately reached 25%, climbed slowly enough that each month's deterioration could be rationalized as temporary. Each bank failure explained as an isolated incident, each business closure attributed to local factors rather than systemic collapse. This gradual transmission gave the social fabric time. Not enough time, ultimately, but time to absorb each shock before the next arrived. Communities could organize informal support networks. Churches and charities could mobilize. Extended family structures could provide partial buffers. The horror of the Great Depression was immense and prolonged, but it was, in its progression, human-scaled. It moved at the speed of telegrams and newspaper deadlines and physical bank queues. 2026 will not move at that speed. The Venezuelan Bolívar collapse of 2016 and 2017, the most complete peacetime economic collapse of a major economy in the 21st century, offers the most relevant modern parallel for transmission speed in a digitally connected society. Venezuela's hyperinflation, which reached 65,000% annually by 2018, was not simply an economic event. It was a total social reorganization compressed into an extraordinarily short time frame. Within 18 months of the hyperinflation's onset, the country had lost an estimated 10% of its population to emigration, approximately 3 million people. Hospital systems collapsed. Grocery stores emptied. Established social hierarchies dissolved overnight as currency holding became the only relevant measure of survival capacity. Venezuela is not the United States, but Venezuela had oil. Venezuela had a functioning government, however corrupt. Venezuela had international relationships that provided some external support. And Venezuela collapsed anyway, faster than any government or institution was capable of managing. The United States in 2026 has something Venezuela did not have. 350 million people, 400 million firearms, a social media ecosystem capable of transmitting panic at the speed of light, and a political environment already operating at a temperature that would have been considered extreme in any previous decade of American history. The supply chain layer, when finance meets physical reality. There is one dimension of the coming crisis that rarely receives adequate attention in purely financial analysis, because it sits at the intersection of finance and physical logistics in a way that most economists are not trained to model. Modern supply chains operate on credit. Container ship crossing the Pacific is financed by a letter of credit. The inventory sitting in a distribution warehouse is financed by a revolving credit line. The raw materials in a manufacturing facility are purchased on supplier credit. The entire physical flow of goods, from production to distribution to retail, is lubricated at every stage by access to short-term credit. When credit markets freeze, as they did, briefly and partially, in October 2008, supply chains do not immediately break. They strain, they slow. They create shortages that seem inexplicable to consumers who don't understand that the product they can't find on the shelf disappeared not because it wasn't manufactured, but because the credit line that financed its shipment was suspended. In 2008, the credit freeze lasted approximately 3 weeks before the TERP authorization and Federal Reserve interventions restored sufficient confidence to restart credit flows. 3 weeks of partial credit restriction produced observable shortages and supply disruptions visible to ordinary consumers. A credit restriction lasting not 3 weeks but 3 months. In a crisis where the rescue mechanisms have already been deployed and the institutional trust required to make new rescue mechanisms credible is absent, would not produce shortages. It would produce the kind of supply chain collapse that COVID-19 previewed in its first months. But without the government transfer payments that cushioned the economic blow, and without the supply chain recovery that followed once production restarted, the social consequences of that scenario, in a population already at maximum institutional distrust, operating at maximum political polarization, processing information at maximum velocity through social media, are not difficult to model. They are simply uncomfortable to state directly. The feedback loop that governments cannot break. The final, and most important, characteristic of the social fracture is that it creates a feedback loop that government intervention cannot easily interrupt. Economic distress increases distrust of institutions. Increased distrust reduces the effectiveness of institutional responses to economic distress. Less effective institutional responses deepen economic distress. Deeper economic distress further increases distrust. And so on, tightening with each iteration until either the distress resolves, which requires institutional effectiveness that the distrust has already undermined, or the institutions themselves are replaced by something new. In every historical case where this feedback loop has completed its full cycle, Weimar, Germany, Revolutionary France, Argentina, in 2001, Venezuela in 2016, the resolution has involved fundamental political transformation, sometimes peaceful, sometimes not, always profound. Understanding the social fracture is essential to understanding the scale of what is forming. But there is one final dimension, the longest view. The 100-year pattern that subsumes all the others, that places everything we have examined into its true historical context. It is the framework that explains not just why this crisis is coming, but why it was, in some fundamental sense, always going to come. It is the century's end, and that is where we go now. In the summer of 1938, a man sat alone in a cell in the Suzdale's Special Purpose Prison, 200 miles northeast of Moscow, and waited. Nikolai Kondratiev had been waiting for years, arrested in 1930, sentenced, transferred between facilities, kept alive long enough for the state to extract whatever additional confessions the interrogators believed they needed. He had once been one of the most respected economists in the Soviet Union, the director of the Moscow Business Conditions Institute, an advisor to the government on agricultural policy. He had written papers that were read in London and New York and Berlin. He had corresponded with John Maynard Keynes. What had destroyed him was a graph showing that capitalism did not move toward inevitable terminal collapse, as Marxist doctrine required, but instead cycled, expanded, and contracted, recovered and rebuilt, over and over in long waves of approximately 50 to 60 years, with the mechanical regularity of a tide. The implication was heretical. Capitalism could survive. Stalin could not permit that conclusion to circulate. On September 17, 1938, Nikolai Kondratiev was shot. His waves survived him by 7 years. Those waves extended, refined, and integrated into a broader framework of 100-year historical cycles are pointing toward a convergence that is visible only if you are willing to look at history in the longest time frame available. Most people are not. Most analysts, most investors, most policymakers operate within a horizon of quarters and years, occasionally decades. The 100-year view is left to historians, and historians rarely speak the language of financial markets. The result is a blind spot of catastrophic proportions. Because the most important pattern operating in the global financial system right now is not visible at any timescale shorter than a century. The Kondratiev winter, and why we are inside it. Kondratiev's original research identified 4 phases within each long wave, which he called spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The phases correspond to recognizable economic conditions. Spring is reconstruction and early growth. Summer is peak prosperity and the beginning of inflation. Autumn is financial speculation and debt accumulation as real growth slows. Winter is the deflationary reckoning, the forced liquidation of the debt and speculative excesses accumulated in autumn. Winters are not recessions. Recessions occur within all 4 phases. Winters are structural periods of fundamental reorganization, during which the accumulated imbalances of an entire long cycle are resolved, one way or another, over a period of 10 to 20 years. The last Kondratiev winter began approximately in 2000, when the dot-com bubble, the speculative peak of the autumn phase, began to deflate. It was interrupted, artificially and temporarily, by the debt-fueled expansion of 2003 to 2007, and then again by the extraordinary monetary interventions of 2008 to 2020. Each interruption prevented the winter from running its natural course, from allowing the necessary liquidation of debt and speculative excess to clear the system for the next spring. The consequence of interrupting a winter is not the prevention of the reckoning. It is the accumulation of additional imbalances on top of the original ones. The debt that was not liquidated in 2008 grew larger. Speculative excess that was not cleared in 2020 expanded to encompass entire new asset classes. Cryptocurrencies, meme stocks, commercial real estate, private equity valued at multiples that assumed permanent zero interest rates. The winter that was postponed became, with each postponement, more severe. Kondratiev estimated, based on his data, that each long wave lasted 50 to 60 years. The current wave began approximately in 1949 with the post-war reconstruction boom. By his framework, the winter of this wave, the reckoning that cannot be indefinitely postponed, arrives somewhere between 2009 and 2029. We are inside that window, and we have been postponing the reckoning for 15 years. The 100-year pattern, 3 data points that should terrify you beyond the Kondrativ wave. There is a broader 100-year pattern that appears across financial history with a consistency that demands examination. Ghent, even by those who are skeptical of cyclical frameworks. Consider 3 data points. First, the Panic of 1825. Britain, fresh from the Napoleonic Wars, experienced an explosion of credit-driven speculation in Latin American sovereign bonds, mining ventures, and domestic infrastructure projects. Interest rates, which had been elevated through the war period, fell sharply as peace returned. Easy money flowed into increasingly speculative investments. The Bank of England, facing a gold drain as the credit bubble expanded, was forced to raise rates aggressively. The credit bubble burst. Approximately 70 British banks failed in 1825 and 1826. The crisis spread to Latin America, where several newly independent nations, whose bonds had been enthusiastically purchased in London, defaulted. It was the first truly global financial crisis of the modern era. Second, the Panic of 1929. Exactly 104 years later, the precise mechanism repeated at larger scale. Post-war credit expansion, driven by easy money and new financial instruments, margin lending. Investment trusts, international bond markets, fueled speculation in stocks, real estate, and international sovereign debt. When the contraction came, it was global, synchronized, and devastating. Approximately 9,000 American banks failed. International trade collapsed. The political consequences reshaped the world for a generation. Third, the convergence of 2026 to 2033. Approximately 97 to 104 years after 1929. The mechanism, the largest post-war credit expansion in history. Driven by the easiest money in recorded history, zero interest rates, quantitative easing, direct monetary financing of government deficits, fueling speculation in every asset class simultaneously. The preconditions for contraction, assembled with a completeness that 1825 and 1929 could not match. 3 crises, 3 approximately 100-year intervals. The same mechanism, the same sequence, the same structural logic, operating at increasing scale each time. Because each time the financial system was larger, more interconnected, and more leveraged than the last. This is not a coincidence requiring explanation. It is a pattern requiring attention. The Ray Dalio framework. When 3 cycles converge, Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund, with $150 billion in assets under management, spent decades studying what he calls the big cycle, the long-term pattern of rise and decline in the internal and external order of dominant powers. His framework identifies 3 cycles that operate simultaneously within any major civilization: the long-term debt cycle, running approximately 50 to 100 years, the internal political cycle, running approximately 10 to 30 years, and the external geopolitical cycle, running approximately 50 to 150 years. Most of the time, these 3 cycles are at different points in their progression, which means that when one creates stress, the others provide stability. What Dalio found and documented extensively in his 2021 work on the changing world order is that the truly catastrophic historical moments occur not when one cycle reaches its stress point, but when all 3 arrive at their stress points simultaneously. When the long-term debt cycle reaches its ceiling, the internal political order is already fractured, and the external geopolitical order is an active contest between a declining power and a rising challenger. He identified 6 such convergences in the last 500 years. In every case, the convergence produced what he calls a paradigm shift, a fundamental reorganization of the financial, political, and geopolitical order that left the world structurally different at the end of the transition than it had been at the beginning. The 6 convergences. The transition from Portuguese to Spanish dominance in the early 1500s. The transition from Spanish to Dutch dominance in the mid-1600s. The transition from Dutch to British dominance in the early 1700s. The British consolidation following the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s. The transition from British to American dominance across 1914 to 1945. In the current period, Dalio is explicit on this point. All three cycles, the long-term debt cycle, the internal political cycle, and the external geopolitical cycle, are simultaneously at their stress points in the United States for the first time since the 1930s and 1940s. Long-term debt at historic extremes. Internal political polarization at levels not measured since the Civil War era. External geopolitical contest with China at its most acute since the Cold War's most dangerous moments. The last time this convergence occurred, it produced World War II. The Roman debasement. The pattern that never changes. The Roman Empire offers the longest and most complete historical case study of what happens when a dominant monetary power enters the terminal phase of its cycle and refuses, at each stage, to make the structural adjustments that might have altered the outcome. Between 60 AD and 268 AD, a period of approximately 200 years, the silver content of the Roman denarius fell from 90% to less than 2%. The process was gradual, almost imperceptible in any single generation. Each emperor who debased the currency did so under the pressure of immediate necessity. The legions needed paying, a grain dole needed funding, the borders needed defending. Each debasement provided temporary relief and created permanent deterioration. By the mid-3rd century, the Roman economy was experiencing what modern economists would recognize as stagflation: rising prices, falling real wages, declining trade, and contracting economic output, all occurring simultaneously. The administrative complexity required to maintain the empire's functioning had grown beyond the revenue base's capacity to support it. The military, which had once been funded by conquest and tribute, was now consuming the savings of the population it was theoretically defending. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's eastern continuation, survived the Western collapse by making structural adjustments that Rome proper refused to make, reducing administrative complexity. Reforming taxation, maintaining tighter monetary discipline, Byzantium survived another 1,000 years until 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, not because it avoided all crises, but because its institutional flexibility allowed it to absorb crises that would have been terminal at Rome's level of structural rigidity. The lesson is not that empires always collapse. The lesson is that empires which refuse structural adjustment, when adjustment is still possible, eventually face adjustment that is no longer chosen, it is imposed. By circumstances, by markets, or by external powers who have been watching the deterioration with patient strategic interest. The new Bretton Woods, what resolution requires? Every previous resolution of a convergence crisis of this magnitude, every successful navigation of a Dalio paradigm shift has required one thing that no financial tool, no central bank intervention, and no monetary policy can substitute for: political will sufficient to impose genuine structural sacrifice on populations that have been told for decades that sacrifice is unnecessary. The original Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 was only possible because the preceding 5 years had produced 70 million deaths, the physical destruction of most of Europe and significant portions of Asia, and the complete delegitimization of the political orders that had failed to prevent the catastrophe. The sacrifice required to build a new monetary order, the sacrifice of national monetary sovereignty, the acceptance of American financial dominance, the commitment to multilateral institutions was possible because the alternative was visible in the rubble of every major European city. A new Bretton Woods, a genuine restructuring of the global monetary order adequate to the scale of the imbalances that have accumulated, would require comparable political conditions. Not necessarily a world war, but something that produces the same clarity of necessity, the same collapse of the existing order's legitimacy, the same desperate search for something, anything that works. That something may be what the coming crisis provides. The century's end is not a metaphor, Condret's winter. It's the 100-year debt supercycle, Dalio's big cycle convergence. The Roman debasement pattern, the reserve currency succession sequence. 5 independent analytical frameworks developed across different disciplines by different researchers using different methodologies, arriving at the same window. The century's end is not a metaphor. It is not a rhetorical device. It is a measurable, recurring, historically documented pattern that has appeared in one form or another. At the conclusion of every major monetary era in the last 500 years of recorded economic history, we are inside it. The question that remains, the question that history poses to every generation that finds itself at this kind of inflection point, is not whether the transition comes. Every previous convergence has resolved one way or another. The question is what form the resolution takes, whether it is managed or chaotic, whether it is negotiated or imposed, whether the institutions of the existing order demonstrate sufficient adaptability to guide the transition, or whether they are swept away by it, leaving whatever comes next to be built in conditions that no one currently living would choose. That question, and the historical record on how it has been answered before, is where this documentary ends. And the ending, as it always is when history speaks honestly, is not comfortable. In the spring of 1647, a Spanish treasury official named Diego Saavedra Fajardo sat in Madrid and wrote a letter to King Philip IV that has survived, largely unread, in the archives of the Spanish Royal Library for nearly 4 centuries. The letter was precise, methodical, and completely ignored. Saavedra Fajardo laid out, in careful arithmetic, the trajectory of the Spanish crown's finances. The debt service consuming 80% of annual revenues. The silver convoys from the New World growing smaller each decade as the mines of Potosi exhausted their richest veins. The military commitments in Flanders, in Italy, in Portugal, in Catalonia, each individually justifiable, collectively insupportable. The 6 previous debt restructurings, each one framed as the final correction, each one adding new obligations on top of unresolved old ones. He was not predicting catastrophe, he was describing it. In present tense, with numbers. Philip IV did not respond to the letter. The machinery of the Spanish court, its rituals, its factions, its deeply embedded belief that the empire was too important, too powerful, too central to God's providential design to be permitted to fail, continued turning. The 7th default came later that same year. It was, unlike its predecessors, unrecoverable. Spain never again occupied the center of the world's financial order. The letter exists, the numbers were right, the timing was accurate, the warning was complete. Nobody acted on it. The pattern of the unheeded warning? This is the detail that history returns to, again and again. With a consistency more disturbing than any financial statistic, it is not that the warnings were absent. It is not that the analysis was wrong. It is not that the information was unavailable. The warnings were present. The analysis was correct. Information was available. In 1928, economist Roger Babson stood before the American Statistical Association and delivered a speech warning of an inevitable, severe stock market collapse, driven by excessive margin lending, speculative excess, and a disconnection between asset prices and underlying economic productivity. He was dismissed. The following year, the market fell 89%. In 2005, economist Raghuram Rajan, then chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, delivered a paper at the Federal Reserve's annual Jackson Hole Conference warning that financial innovation had created hidden systemic risk of a magnitude that could produce a catastrophic crisis. He was publicly mocked by Lawrence Summers, then the most influential economist in America, who called his analysis misguided. 3 years later, Lehman Brothers collapsed. In 2010, Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff published the most comprehensive study of sovereign debt crises ever assembled, 8 centuries of data across 66 countries, demonstrating that when government debt to GDP ratios exceed approximately 90%, economic growth slows dramatically and the risk of crisis increases non-linearly. The United States crossed 90% debt to GDP in 2010. It is currently at 123%. Their work was studied, cited, debated, and its implications were not acted upon. The unheeded warning is not an anomaly in the historical record. It is the standard. It is what always happens. Because acting on a structural warning requires accepting immediate pain to prevent future catastrophe, and the political economy of every democratic system, and most non-democratic ones, rewards the postponement of pain and punishes its imposition. This is not a criticism of any particular government or political party. It is a description of how systems behave when the costs of action are immediate, and certain while the costs of inaction are future and deniable. What the historical record actually shows of the 17 major monetary systems that entered the terminal phase of a long debt cycle in the last 200 years? 11 proceeded to some form of systemic collapse, currency failure, sovereign default, political revolution, or some combination of all three. 6 achieved partial resets, managed transitions that preserved some institutional continuity, while fundamentally restructuring the monetary order. Of those 6, 5 required external shocks sufficient to overcome internal political resistance to structural adjustment. 4 of those 5 external shocks were world wars or their immediate aftermath. The 6th and only example of a managed monetary reset achieved without catastrophic external shock is the Bretton Woods Conference itself. And Bretton Woods was designed in the shadow of a war that had just ended, by statesmen who had lived through both the Great Depression and the Second World War, who possessed a clarity about the costs of monetary disorder that no generation since has had occasion to develop. The men in that room in New Hampshire had seen what happens when monetary systems fail. They had seen it in the breadlines of the 1930s, in the political extremism that followed, in the 60 million graves that extremism eventually filled. That experience, that specific, visceral, irreplaceable knowledge of what monetary disorder produces, was what made Bretton Woods possible. The generation that carries that knowledge is gone. The generation now managing the global financial system has lived its entire professional life in the era of the rescue, the era in which every crisis was met with intervention. Every collapse was arrested before completion. Every consequence was deferred rather than absorbed. They know, intellectually, that the tools they have used have limits. But knowing intellectually and knowing in the bone are different things. And it is the bone knowledge, the knowledge that comes from having watched the consequences complete, that produces the political will for genuine structural sacrifice. The Cyprus lesson: what happens to those who weren't ready? On the morning of March 16, 2013, Cypriots woke to news that the European Union and the IMF had agreed to a bailout of the Cypriot banking system on the expunged condition that depositors themselves contribute to the rescue. Bank accounts holding more than 100,000 euros would be subject to a levy of up to 47.5%. Savings that people had spent decades accumulating would be confiscated, partially without warning, over a weekend. The ATMs were restricted. Capital controls were imposed. For 2 weeks, Cypriots could not freely access their own money. Cyprus was a small economy, GDP of approximately 18 billion euros at the time. The total depositor levy affected a relatively small number of people in global terms. The event lasted weeks, not years. And yet, for the people inside it, for the business owner who had structured her entire retirement around those savings, for the family that had sold a property and parked the proceeds in a Cypriot bank account, for the retiree who had followed every rule and made every reasonable decision and still lost nearly half of what he had accumulated, it was total. It was absolute. It was the complete and sudden discovery that the rules they had understood to govern their financial lives did not apply in the way they had been told. The Cyprus bail-in was not the end of the world. It was a preview, small, contained, ultimately survivable at the systemic level. But it contained within it, in compressed form, every element of what a larger version of the same event produces: the shock of confiscation, the paralysis of restricted access, the realization that proximity to the crisis determines outcome in ways that expertise and prudence cannot fully compensate for. The people who had moved their savings out of Cypriot banks in the months before, March 2013, not because they predicted the crisis with precision, but because they understood that Cypriot banks were structurally vulnerable and acted on that understanding, were not made whole. They were simply not harmed. The distinction between those two outcomes was made not by luck, not by superior intelligence, but by the willingness to act on structural analysis before the event made action impossible. Every empire in Stage 6 believed it would be the exception. This is the sentence that should follow every conversation about American financial trajectory, about dollar dominance, about debt sustainability, about the derivatives overhang, the maturity wall, the demographic cliff, the de-dollarization trend, the social fracture, and the century's end pattern. Every empire believed it would be the exception. Philip IV Spain believed it after the first default, and the second, the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth. Imperial Britain believed it in 1913, 1 year before the century's most destructive war began dismantling. The empire that had seemed from the inside as permanent as geography? The Soviet Union believed it in 1988, 3 years before it ceased to exist. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered on December 25, 1991. In 1988, the CIA's official assessment was that the Soviet economy, while troubled, was fundamentally stable. It's the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world. With access to every available data point, missed the terminal stage until it was already completing. America is not the Soviet Union. The comparison is structural, not moral. The point is not that America will collapse in the same way, on the same timeline, for the same reasons. The point is that every system in Stage 6, every system in the terminal phase of a long monetary cycle, at the convergence of debt, currency, geopolitical, and social stress, has believed that its particular combination of institutional strength, historical exceptionalism, and sheer scale made it immune to the pattern. The pattern has not agreed. The final question, the last time all of these forces converged simultaneously, debt supercycle peak, reserve currency transition, institutional trust collapse, geopolitical order contest, Kondrativ winter, it did not end with a recession, did not end with a market correction. It did not end with a restructuring plan and a press conference and a cautious return to growth. It ended with the redrawing of the world map, with the creation of entirely new institutions to replace the ones that had failed, a fundamental reorganization of who held power, whose currency governed trade, whose military enforced order, and whose vision of the future was permitted to shape the decades that followed. That reorganization took 30 years from the beginning of the First World War, in 1914, to the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. 30 years of depression, war, devastation, and reconstruction before the new order was stable enough to function. We are at the beginning of a comparable transition. The signals are assembled. The patterns are visible. The frameworks, every independent framework applied to this moment, point toward the same window. What gets redrawn this time is the question that history is now preparing to answer. The only question that matters, the only question that has ever mattered at moments like this one, is whether you will be among those who understood where the pattern was heading before the pattern completed. Because by the time it completes, as Diego Saavedra Fajardo understood in 1647, as Roger Babson understood in 1928, as Raghuram Rajan understood in 2005, the letter has already been written. The numbers are already right, the warning is already complete. And it is, once again, being ignored.